Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Healing Lyme Summit. I'm your host, Dr. Mariah Hinchy, and today we are talking with one of my favorite people, Dr. Nguyen Schwander. He is a practicing physician in Michigan with a retired board certification in emergency medicine and a current board certification in integrative and holistic medicine. He has been seeing patients in his Ann Arbor, Michigan clinic for over 35 years and specializes in managing chronically ill, medically complex children and adults, including those with chronic Lyme symptoms. He is the current president of the Medical Academy of Pediatric Special Needs, or MAPS, which is an organization dedicated to training practitioners in the integrative approach to chronic pediatric conditions, including autism. He is also a member of multiple medical societies, including the International Lyme and Associated Disease Society, or ILADS. Dr. Ngu is a sought-after speaker on the topics of the impact of the gut on health, biomedical treatments of autism and other neurodevelopmental disorders, management of immune activation and immune injury syndromes, and the impact of the environment on the health of our children. Dr. Ngu is a tireless crusader for parental and individual rights when it comes to our bodily autonomy. My favorite fact of all of these accomplishments is that Dr. Ngu considers his biggest accomplishment to be the thousands of patients that he has helped over the course of his career, most of which came to him with little or no hope. So welcome, Dr. Ngu. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
My pleasure, Mariah. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So why don't we start off by kind of bridging that gap? How did you start out in emergency medicine and end up doing what you're doing now?
Well, I mean, originally, I went to medical school to learn how to heal people, and believe it or not, they don't teach you that in medical school. So I ended up in a surgery residency because at least you're removing disease from people, and it was really cool. I love that. But, in the process, you hang out your shingle, you start, our tagline was healing illness at its source. And, you start looking for root causes. What's causing the problem? What's causing the problem? What's causing the problem? Very rapidly, you're going to end up in the world of chronic Lyme, of toxicity. I started primarily treating adults around 2005. I got dragged kicking and screaming into the world of integrative pediatrics, because my wife thought it'd be a good idea for us to do that since I wasn't busy enough. But, that's been game changing. I mean, it's, you change the life of a child. You just improved the next 70 years of their life. You change the life of a 70-year-old, maybe the next 10 years, 20 years. So, yeah. But that's how I got here. And, back in the 80s when I was doing this, there just weren't a lot of resources. I mean, there barely was an internet. And so a lot of this initially was self-taught. But there's nothing like, the kind of information you can get now. I mean, these kinds of summits are phenomenal, to be able to get the information out to folks and to practitioners as well.
Yeah. And that's part of why I love doing this. I mean, we really have the opportunity to impact, like 50,000 different people's lives who may not hear the information that we're going to talk about today. And a lot of Lyme is very different in the pediatric world. And I think we are so quick to diagnose and slap a medication on all of these kids, especially when it comes to neuropsychiatric issues. And, there's always the root cause, right? A lot of times it can be infectious. It can be nutrient deficiencies. It can be a multitude of things, but there's always an underlying root cause. And I think that's why the work that we do is so important, because we figure it out and we focus on healing that. So let's start off, since this is a Lyme Summit, let's talk about the difference between some of the unique features that you would see in a pediatric patient versus an adult patient suffering with chronic Lyme or another co-infection.
Well, I mean, kids are, just by their nature a little bit more susceptible because of their size and the fact that they're the ones that are going to be running through the tall grasses and the woods and all that stuff more likely than the parents are. And because of the size difference, depending on the age of the kid, they're more likely to have tick bites in places that aren't obvious, like the scalp, where the hair is covering it. You don't necessarily see it if you're not doing a good tick evaluation. And then the other thing is, if you're living in an area that's endemic and you have pets, they're much more likely to be all over the pet, and the pet may have the ticks, and the kid can get it from there. The other big thing with kids is whether it's because the tick bites are more likely to be in the head and neck area, or whether it's just, less mature blood-brain barrier or whatever it is, these kids are more likely to have neural Lyme than adults are. So the rate of a neural Lyme in adults might be in the 10 to 15% of all, clinical cases. With kids, it's more like 25%. So, and the trouble is, it's not going to manifest as necessarily, your classic bullseye rash or a swollen joint or whatever. It may just manifest as a behavioral change. And then that becomes very, very difficult. And we also know from studies in areas where it's endemic, that 25% of kids in these areas can have antibodies to Lyme, not have any symptoms, so they're more likely to get, the neurologic stuff, but they're also more likely to just blow it off, to be able to have the appropriate immune response and get rid of the spirochete and not actually get Lyme. But the important thing for everybody to understand is, if you have a kid that, is going down a certain road and all of a sudden, the devil inhabited them and they're changed and they're OCD and they're anxious and they're, aggressive and, they don't want to do things they did before. And, you have those kinds of changes. There's going to be a reason for it. And Lyme is one of those reasons, and it always has to be in the back of our thought process when we're looking at these kids. So kids are more likely, if they do have a joint, it's more likely to be inflamed and swollen than an adult. Again, they're going to have a more aggressive immune response usually. So those are some of the main differences between kids and adults.
Right. And so one of the big red flags being that abrupt change in personality, behavior, cognition, anything like that, and not to explain that away.
And, the trouble is frequently it's going to be in kids that already have some of those symptoms. I deal with a lot of kids on the autism spectrum. So, they already have neurologic issues. They have, putting it in quotes, psychiatric issues that are associated with their neurology. If they get exposed to Lyme and have an immune response to neural Lyme in particular, then, you're going to see an exacerbation of what's already there. So it might not be a new symptom, but a volume increase on what they had in the past.
Yeah, I always like to say Lyme and co-infections, they tend to prey on our weaknesses and vulnerabilities, whether they're genetic or just, a past injury or something like that, because it likes to go to the areas of dysfunction and inflammation. Do you think that in sort of, in the autism spectrum, right? It's all of these various pieces of the puzzle. You could have 3 children on the spectrum sitting in front of you, and they might have, 5 different combinations of various characteristics, right? That are the root cause of their autism. How much of a role do you think congenital Lyme or congenital Bartonella or other co-infections are a piece of that puzzle?
Let me say definitively, I have no idea. No. No, we don't really, at least in my research, we don't have great research on that. The bottom line with the congenital Lyme or the congenital Bartonella, I think Bartonella is a lot worse than Borrelia, which is the Lyme spirochete. The issue there is twofold. Number one, you have the organism itself. Is that being transmitted? And it can. Does it get transmitted? Who knows, but it can. It's the same with other illnesses like HIV and those kinds of things. It's not 100% transmission. It's not even very great transmission. So, but that's one thing. The other thing is, if mom has immune activation as a result of having it, the immune activation of the mother will affect the neurologic development of the baby in utero. So that fetus brain development is going to be influenced by inflammation created by mom having that. So once that child is born, it's interesting because, we're back to this Louis Pasteur thing. We focus in on the bug because bugs cause disease, but not really. I mean, it's your response to the bug that causes the disease, the symptoms that we call the disease. So if you have a baby, an infant that is developing an immune system, and that immune system can adapt to what's there, in the same way we adapt to all the normal bacteria inside and on top of our body. If the Bartonella or the Borrelia is part of that ecosystem, then you can actually have immune tolerance to those organisms, and then they almost become like probiotic organisms rather than disease-causing organisms. Again, all this is based on, what I've observed, what I've seen with my patients. I don't have good data on those points at all to say, oh, if mom has, a subclinical Lyme, she has a spirochete, that means that 27% of all babies born in that state are going to have congenital Lyme, and 80% of those kids are going to develop neurodevelopmental issues as a result of it. I just don't have those kinds of numbers to describe it. I mean, to me, at the end of the day, kids are healing machines. Old farts like me, we're going to have problems. Kids, not so much. I mean, they just, they have the ability to adapt to what the environment is throwing at them. And so even if you have those congenital issues, supporting their immune system, supporting their digestion, all the things we do in integrated medicine, that's key to helping them develop, and not necessarily, oh, gee, we need to put this 6-month-old, IV Rocephin or something.
Right. So, you kind of bring up the point that in, conventional medicine, infections are treated with antibiotics, and infections, thinking about bolstering the immune system or healing the body when someone has an infection is kind of like a foreign concept, right? Like we use man-made antibiotics or sometimes herbals to really focus on killing that organism. And so I know that you and I kind of have the same opinion when it comes to using, very strong combinations and excessive amounts of these antibiotics, that's not the best idea. So talk with us about how you think that these antibiotics are a dismal failure and can actually worsen the situation by further weakening the immune system.
So you've got, antibiotics and drugs in general. I mean, I'm picking on antibiotics today, but drugs in general, the drug has toxicity, right? So if you're going to take a drug for a week, okay, you probably can recover from that toxicity. If you're going to take a drug for a month, that's going to be tough. If you're going to take a drug for 6 months or a year or however long some of these folks are on these antibiotic protocols, you're going to have problems with it. Right. We've seen drugs like statin drugs. A statin drug, if you have heart disease, you're at high risk of having a heart attack, statin drug will reduce your risk of a heart attack 30 to 40%. Okay. That's not great, but it's an improvement. But that statin drug really is not going to make you live any longer. Because you have to take it every day for the rest of your life. And eventually the toxicity of the statin drug is going to exceed any benefit, and you'll die of something else at the same age you would have died of a heart attack. Right. So it doesn't really, that's the problem with pharmaceuticals. So the antibiotics, we've got a few things going on here, because it's not just the toxicity of the antibiotic. When they take this antibiotic, okay, what does it do to your liver, your kidney, that sort of stuff. That's one set of toxicity. The biggest thing with antibiotic toxicity is what are you doing to the gut ecosystem? Right? Because if you want to say, okay, Dr. New, I want to improve the function of my immune system, what should I do? The first thing I'm going to talk about is your gut, because the immune system basically lives there. You got 85% of all the immune function is the lining of your gut. That is the interface between the inside world and the outside world, because we're taking in food that's not sterile. We have to have a way to prevent ourselves from dying of food poisoning every time we eat. And so the gut has this huge immune system. We know that there's signaling between the gut ecosystem, the bacteria in our gut, interact with our immune system. They're signaling back and forth. And if you want to have an intact immune system, you have to have the right bacteria in the gut. We know from animal studies, you have these mice that are sterile. Their gut's sterile. They're born without any bacteria. Their immune system can't function. So you have to have those bacteria. So if I come in with these antibiotics and I change that gut ecosystem, we're screwing things up. Now again, what's the difference between children and adults? I'm 64 years old. You give me an antibiotic. chances are my gut is going to bounce back to whatever I was at before I started those antibiotics. But if you give me a 6-year-old or a 4-year-old or especially a 6-month-old and you give them antibiotics, you can permanently alter that gut ecosystem for the rest of their life. Oh, gee, why don't you have any bifidobacillus? Oh, that's because Dr. Noon gave me, Augmentin when I was 6 months old. That can happen, right? And so you have to be very, very careful when you're using these things. The success rate, even for, you walk in with the tick and you got a bullseye rash and my knee hurts, even for, that type of Lyme, I mean, the success rate is less than 50%. I mean, it's pathetic, right? And people need to understand, even if I give you antibiotics for strep, okay, strep, rapidly divides, responds to antibiotics. Why do I give you an antibiotic to come in with strep throat? The difference between taking the antibiotic, not taking the antibiotic, if you take the antibiotic, you're going to clear the strep in 3 to 5 days. If you don't take the antibiotic, you're going to clear the strep in 5 to 7 days. So why the heck do we even use it? Right? It's 2 days. It's because it prevents the autoimmune disorders that can be created with strep. That's actually why we use it. We're not actually taking them to kill bacteria. So we got the same issue here that, you're dealing with a different type of bacteria. Antibiotics are kind of a dismal failure. And because they affect the gut so much, now you're screwing up the immune system. The immune system is is your biggest ally in terms of trying to get rid of infections in the first place. So here you take an antibiotic, it has toxicity to organs, it has toxicity to the gut, it's going to make your immune system weaker, and that's just going to allow it to persist over the long run. And I really think that's a big reason why it's been a failure, and particularly with kids, And again, say it again, kids are healing machines, give them the right stuff, most of the time they're going to be able to take care of it.
Yeah. I think one of the most important points to make on the backside of that for our listeners is I think a lot of people think that an antibiotic takes whatever this infection is, any infection, you mentioned strep, and it takes it from the trillion organisms that it is to zero. And it's like, there's no antibiotic that completely obliterates any bacteria. It's like the antibiotics lowers the load to the point that the immune system can then come in and eradicate it, right? Or hold it in remission, whatever the case may be. It makes it, low enough that it's not causing an issue anymore. And so that for me was my moment. I did a lot of integrative treatment. I was like, why are the people that refuses antibiotics and only want to do herbs getting better and actually able to stay in remission? And it was when I realized the connection between the immune system, the gut, the microbiome, and that you literally can't rebuild the immune system while you are destroying the microbiome in the gut. So
I mean, this was a lesson we learned from HIV and the bad days of the HIV epidemic, because these patients would have zero helper cells. Their T helper cell count would be zero. And these patients would die of simple infections. And when they died, they were on 3 antibiotics, antifungals, antivirals, every anti-whatever that we had, and they still died of infection. So it's true. And the other thing is it's just simple math sometimes. If you're looking at an acute strep infection, well, strep will divide every 2-3 hours. I mean, it's very rapid. So if in order to bring the numbers down, let's say you need 20 cell divisions. All right. So at 2 hours, per cell division, you need 40 hours, whatever it is, 2-3 days of antibiotics will knock out strep. But if you're talking spirochete, even bullseye spirochete, maybe it divides a couple times a week. So if you need 10 or 20 cell divisions, that's 10 weeks of antibiotics for a bullseye rash. If you're talking a persister form, a form that might be dividing once or twice a year, okay, well, 2 into 20, that's 10 years of treatment. I mean, who the heck is going to take 10 years of antibiotics to try and bring this down to a number that might work? And what are you going to do to the body after 10 years of antibiotics, right? I mean, that's the whole issue with antibiotics. And for me, especially with adults, the whole thing for me is that the reason why any of us even consider it is because we've all had those patients that come in and they've had 5 years of symptoms, and you do the testing and you go, man, you look like you have Lyme, and you put them on a month of antibiotics and you cure their symptoms. I mean, that's happened. And
Yeah.
that's why, those of us with that stupid MD after our name still think allopathically, and we still have that on our list of things we use. But I'm just saying with kids, most of the time I think it's a mistake to use them. And again, I know there are many people out there that's sacrilege, but I mean, that's been my experience with it. I don't have great success with the antibiotic protocols, and I do have much better success with the herbs, the lifestyle, fixing the gut, that sort of thing. And, we've lived, I know infection was a problem, but we lived for gazillions of years without antibiotics. And again, in the wild, if you look at animals, they tend not to die of infection. They tend to die of starvation and predation, right?
Yeah.
Those are the biggest killers. So.
Well, and I think, there's so many people and kids running around with exposure to a lot of these organisms and other viruses and parasites and all sorts of things. And I think that if the immune system is functioning robustly, and if we're not poisoning ourselves with what we're eating, what we're drinking, what we're putting in our houses, what we're putting on our bodies, et cetera, our immune system does a good job at keeping these organisms in check, but when we have all of this chronic stress and toxicity and, poisonous lifestyle, it's a perfect storm for these organisms to start working synergistically in our bodies and kind of take over. So I know that you believe a lot in lifestyle intervention, nutrition, cleaning up environmental toxicity, etc. So share with our listeners kind of your take and your approach on utilizing all of these things to help a child heal.
Sure. I mean, for me, it really starts with the basics. Like, what is your kid eating? You should go through your house, and not just for your kid, but for yourself and everybody else in the family. I mean, the basics of food are eat real food. Okay. I'm not even talking organic and free range. Just eat real food. Let's start there. Okay. So if it comes in a box and it's been processed, don't eat it. Right. And if I want to eat bread or whatever. Okay. Then go to a bakery where they get up every morning at 1 early o'clock, and they make the dough, and they bake the loaves, and that's what's available to you. That's what you want to eat. Don't go to the grocery store and buy a package of bread that's been sitting on that shelf for a week. God knows when it was made. That's full of preservatives and there's emulsifiers and all the things that screw us up. So real food, and I always say, if you read a label, if there's more than 4 or 5 ingredients, throw it out. If there's anything you can't pronounce, throw it out. If there's anything that's not food on the label, throw it out. Right. So again, why is carrageenan in my food? If you don't know what that is, it's an emulsifier. And the reason why we hate carrageenan, it emulsifies the lining of your gut. All right. So that is really going to mess you up. But, start with real food. Then the next step is, let's get into organic food. All right. Because we know, there's studies out there. If you take kids, you measure their urine, there's all these pesticides and glyphosate and all that stuff in your urine. You put them on an organic diet for a week, and those things disappear from the urine. So it does make a difference to take organic food. And, it's expensive. And so one of the things is, all right, learn which foods are really important that they're organic and foods that are not. So a banana, not so important if it's organic or not. An orange, if you get organic, it's going to have more nutrients and all that stuff in it. But, if you have a grape, better be organic. If you have a strawberry, better be organic. So there's something called the Dirty Dozen or the Dirty 30 or whatever. If you go online, there's different organizations. Environmental Working Group is the one I like, but there's a bunch of them there that'll list foods. Here's the Clean 15, here's the Dirty Dozen. The Clean 15 are the ones that you don't necessarily have to get organic foods. But the Dirty Dozen, I don't eat strawberries if they're not organic. I just don't.
Right.
Celery. I don't eat it if it's not organic. So you really want to know what those are. And then, the next step is, okay, what about the meat? What about the dairy? What about those kinds of things? And that's where how the animal raised matters. So again, for me, the best thing is, find a regenerative farmer and start buying their stuff. And, yeah, it's more expensive than what you're going to get at your local grocery store, but the nutritional content's so much better. It's so much cleaner and so much better for you. So we start with that. And then you have water, right? I mean, it's like, there are people that still drink tap water. I mean, to me, in my world, I mean, I don't think I've drank tap water since forever. Maybe at a restaurant, I was in a desperate moment, drank some of their water, but I mean, I don't drink tap water, and I'm not saying bottled water is any better.
Right.
All right. You want to drink clean water. If the best thing is to have some sort of water purification system at home, a Berkey filter, or I use something called Zero Water. It's just a multi-stage filter. There's all kinds of systems out there. I don't want to get into it, but you want clean water. And then the environment in the house, the environment in the school, the environment in the workplace, that's also critical, but especially at home. So water leaks, mold, carpeting, looks pretty, easy to clean, get rid of it. You need solid surfaces. Same thing with furniture. Cloth furniture, it's very easy for that to take on mold, take on dust, and those kinds of things. It becomes hard to clean. It's much better. Again, these are, you're going to pay for it. It's much better to get leather furniture or something that is easier to clean. And then I'm a fan of using air purifiers. But again, if you're going to use an air purifier, make sure it's good quality. Make sure it's purifying the things in the air you're worried about. So typically we're recommending HEPA filters down to zero point 0.1 microns on the air purifiers. And there's companies that make those that will actually filter out mold toxins, some of the really small ones, right? And then the other big thing is plastics. And I don't know what to do about plastics, but for at the very least, stop using them. Right? Because we know there are micro and nanoplastics in every municipal water supply. Reason 47, not to drink tap water. All right. And don't use it in cooking and even with showering. I mean, nano plastic particles are small enough that they go right through your skin, right through the cell wall, right into the nucleus, into the mitochondria, into the ribosomes of the cell, and they screw up our biochemistry at a molecular level. All right. They screw up our hormones. They screw up our energy production. They screw up our DNA. Bad idea. And they're here to say, I don't, the problem with that is I don't even know how to filter those out, because you'd have to get a filter so tiny. I think your water pressure would go to zero. Right. So.
Yeah. And now all of these new houses that are being built with all of like the PEX piping, right? Like the flexible plastic instead of the old copper piping, so.
Yes.
Just constant exposure.
Yep. What could go wrong? I don't know. Yeah, I think we should all go back to living in teepees and, drinking water out of the brook nearby. The other big thing with kids, is, they need to be outside. Get them off these screens, get them away from the electromagnetic fields. I mean, you can't get away from it. People forget. You go back to, 120 years ago, we really didn't have non-native EMF. All our electromagnetic fields, all the EMF came from the earth and, magnetic field and all that stuff. First we had telegraph, which is not much, but then we had radio. That was really the first big EMF. And, now every house is wired with electricity. We've got a gazillion different channels in that EMF band that we're being exposed to. So, whether you're holding a cell phone or not, doesn't really matter. You're an antenna in this big EMF field. And we didn't have that before. What does that do to the human body? We don't know. And I'm not even talking, 5G and all that stuff. All that's doing is ramping up the intensity of those signals. And there's almost nowhere in the world you can go without getting a signal. So again, that's the other thing of what do you do about that? Keep yourself grounded. I use grounding mats on my bed, but, encourage kids to be outside, encourage kids if you're near water to be in the water, on the sand, and, actually being, barefoot in the grass kind of thing. I know we're in a Lyme conference. Oh.
I didn't let
Sorry.
my
Yeah.
son's feet touch the grass until I knew that he could walk and talk and was a developmentally typical
Just do,
child. My
yeah,
husband
just do
wanted to
a
kill
good tick
me.
check afterwards. Yeah. Do a good
Oh
tick
yes,
check
tick check
afterwards.
every day of his
Yeah.
life.
Yeah. No, and the other big thing is check your house. I mean, I
Yeah.
I've got kids that live nearby, and we check their house, and especially an older house, where people have added on to it, and
Hmm.
I found out one of their houses wasn't even grounded. Like the entire house is
Wow.
grounded, which is not only not bad for you in terms of EMFs, but like, it's a fire risk. It's like,
Yeah.
hope you don't get hit by lightning because your house
Right.
is going to explode,
Yeah.
right? Yeah,
And
somebody
another
has just cut the
super
wire.
cheap thing that you can do is just get one of those timers, where you plug the your modem and all that stuff
Yep.
into it. And at say 11 p.m., it all shuts off. So at least from like
Right.
11 to 6 or 10 to 5 or whatever the case may be, all of that is turned off when everyone is there in the house sleeping. And you can get those things for like, I think 30 or $50.
Yep. No, I mean, for me, if I have patients that, I know you said in the intro, proudest achievement is the thousands of patients I've helped, but I don't remember any of those patients. What I remember are the hundreds of patients that, don't have symptoms. So we're always looking for what else is stopping it. I mean, my fundamental principle in treatment is if a person's not getting better, then there's something you're missing. There's a block that you have to figure out what that block is and how to remove that block. So that's when you get into EMF, you get into light, you get into magnetism, you get into the water quality and the food quality and mold toxins and heavy metals and, the million other things. It's like, well, wait a minute. I thought we were talking about Lyme, right? Those aren't Lyme, but those are the things that prevent people with chronic symptoms from getting better. Right. So that's, a big part of what we do is try to evaluate that environment and then determine, what might be getting in the way of this child getting better or this adult getting better.
Right. Yeah. It's a giant puzzle.
Yes, it will keep me occupied to the end of my days. I have enough ADD that I need to be challenged on a regular basis. And my patients do that for me every day. Thank you, patients. I really appreciate it.
Yes, they keep us entertained in
Yes.
a medically detective sort of
No, absolutely. I
aspect.
mean, you know what it's like. I mean, I don't think a day goes by, and certainly not a week goes by. And I've been in practice for, I like to say 35 plus. I'm just stopping there. I'm not going to
Hmm.
say how long, right?
Hmm.
But, I've been in practice for over 35 years. And, there's not a week that goes by that somebody comes in and at the end of their, I call it the tale of woe. At the end of their tale of woe and evaluation, I have to tell them, look, I have no idea what to do, but I'm going to figure it out and we'll work through this together.
Right.
And that's really what you have to do because I don't think, nobody has the answer for everybody, right? You have to figure out that patient in front of you and what's unique about that patient and how do you move forward with that patient. So, I mean, that's a big part of, why I do what I do with the Medical Academy of Pediatric Special Needs with MAPS, and why we're so interested in training practitioners on these integrative approaches and why I wish every doctor and not just doctors, but every practitioner out there was more aware of this. Most practitioners are, MDs, DOs, not so much, right? But to understand that pharmaceuticals, because medical schools change. I mean, now it's just symptom pharmaceutical, symptom pharmaceutical, symptom pharmaceutical. There's almost no attention to what's causing the problem. What else can you do for this person?
Right.
Right. When I started practicing or when I was in residency, it was, if your patient's on more than 3 drugs, you're a bad doctor. Now it's the opposite. If your patient isn't on at least 3 drugs, you're a bad doctor. Right. And so, we have to keep in mind that every pharmaceutical, doesn't matter what you're taking, which pharmaceutical you're taking, every single one of them has toxicity associated with it. And it is the big reason why the dirty little secret of drugs is that almost none of them help you live longer. I mean,
Right.
that's the dirty little secret of pharmacology. And it's scary because, how many people, even my age, how many people my age are on no medications? Not many.
I can say my
It's a
mother
lot.
is 77 years old. Actually, she just turned 78 and she is on 0 medications.
Awesome.
But she also has this to
Congratulations.
deal with, so. Yep. So
Yeah.
what would you tell our listeners who know or think that one of their children or a child that they know or is in charge of is suffering from Lyme or another vector-borne disease? What advice do you have for them?
Well, like I said, I mean, there's a lot of things you can do on your own in terms of just cleaning up the environment, cleaning up the diet, get good nutrition in there, that sort of thing. The second thing is, I mean, this is a complicated issue. You probably need help in dealing with this. And, to me, there's a couple of big resources. One is ILADS, the International Lyme Associated Disease Society. They have practitioners. Now, they're across the board. And this was always my problem going to ILADS conferences, because you would have people that were like, bigger, stronger, longer, more antibiotics, blah, 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 blah. And then you'd have the other group that's like, oh my God, don't ever use an antibiotic ever. All right. And somewhere between there is the truth, I'm sure. So there's a big difference in the types of practitioners, but that's one resource. The other resource for kids is just MAPS. It's medmaps.org is our website, but this is the Medical Academy of Pediatric Special Needs. I'm a little biased because I am the president of that organization, but our goal is to train practitioners in the integrative treatment of kids with chronic illnesses. So you're going to have practitioners there that are, that have gone through our training, that are familiar with, the integrative approach. And then it's a matter of finding, are they also familiar with Lyme? As we've done whole Lyme weekends at MAPS. Right. So we've done conferences explaining Lyme. We work with ILADS. So we actually do a pediatric themed segment for the ILADS conference as well. So those are two good resources to go to. The trouble is, I live in Michigan, and in Michigan, there's this delusion that there's no Lyme in Michigan. Right. And I always say, if you look at the map, the map of the U.S. where they have a dot for every case of Lyme, I always say all the dots you see in Michigan are probably my patients, because nobody's even looking for it, because they have this delusion that even though 5% of all the ticks along Lake Michigan have Lyme, there's no Lyme disease in Michigan. Right. I mean, going to a mainstream physician is probably not the way to go. You really have to look at an integrated practitioner, and most integrated practitioners that don't have MD or DO after their name are familiar with most of the concepts we're talking about. It's not necessarily Lyme unique. This is, what do you do with somebody that's chronically ill? What do you do with somebody that has immune dysfunction? And at the end of the day, that's why you have symptoms of Lyme disease. Right? Your immune system's not responding the way it's supposed to. Almost any integrated practitioner can help you with that.
Wonderful. So I know that MAPS has its spring conference, March 13th through 15th, and that's in Myrtle Beach this year. Exciting new venue for that. And then you are also lecturing at the Forum for Integrative Medicine, April 3rd through 5th. And then we also have the Fall MAPS conference, which is in the beginning of September. It's always like the first full weekend in September. So the 4th through the 6th in Scottsdale, Arizona. Any other exciting news, either, for yourself or for MAPS, that you want to share with our listeners?
Yeah, I mean, the big thing with MAPS is, because people always say, on the one hand, it's like, well, I'm a chiropractor, I'm a massage therapist, I always say, if you've got a certificate hanging on your wall and you see kids in your practice, even, kids up to 21 years old, you should come to a MAPS conference. If you want to learn integrative medicine in what I think is the most, exciting, unique, thorough format, it's MAPS, fellowship. All right. So, coming to the conference, automatically that first day, you take the first course in the fellowship. So if you choose to do the fellowship, you've already got one of the courses under your belt. But it's, again, it's going back to the roots of what medicine was based on, which is biochemistry. It wasn't based on pharmaceuticals originally. So it's based on biochemistry, and then also understanding how you can manipulate that biochemistry through a bunch of different mechanisms. Again, working on the gut, working on the diet, working on detox, working on the immune system. How do you optimize that? And that's what that's all about. MAPS is exploding. I mean, I think the need for what we do is phenomenal. the Forum for Integrative Medicine conference that's going to be in Austin. I'm excited about that because they're actually allowing me to speak on, that which shall not be named, but, basically how people can suffer injuries from vaccines.
Yeah.
We know it happens, how often we don't, but nobody wants to look at the mechanisms. They think, it's all, but that's what I'm talking about there is really, and that's both practitioners and lay people are welcome at TFIM. But that's what I'm talking about there is really to go through the mechanisms of how this can happen. And again, the solutions are universal. So whether you're treating an injury from a vaccine or you're treating an injury from a chronic infection or even, closed head injuries, chronic infections from Epstein-Barr and all this other stuff, the concepts are the same. Right. And that's really what's exciting about MAPS and what we're doing there. And plus, in case you didn't know, she's one of our fellows in
I'm
MAPS,
one of them.
one of our faculty. So, what's great about that is it's also a community, because I always thought, for years and years and years, I thought I was a lone wolf in the wilderness. I didn't have any sense of community. I felt like I was alone, like all my colleagues thought I was wacko, although they'd send me patients that they couldn't deal with. But, I wasn't part of that group or this group or whatever. And then, you find a community like MAPS and it's like, ooh, these are my people. And we're all focused on what's best for these kids. It's not about politics. It's not about, vindication or revenge or whatever. It's about what is best for these kids. What can we do to improve outcomes for these kids? And that's what's exciting about it because, our future is dependent on these kids. As I like to say, somebody's got to pay for my Social Security because they already spent the money I put into that, right? So somebody's got to pay for it. That's why I'm the president of MAPS. It's got nothing to do with the health of the kids. I just want somebody working that can pay for my Social Security.
Yeah. We all know you're a big softie. Well, I will tell all of our listeners, I'm completely biased. One of the best things that I ever did was get my fellow with MAPS. It helped to solidify everything that I was already doing and everything that I had learned 20 years ago now in medical school from a biochemical standpoint. And I really enjoyed doing it. It was, it seemed like it was overwhelming. And the feedback that I get from some other people is that it seems like it's going to be overwhelming, but it's not. And whether you're a fellow or not, like MAPS is one of my families and I love MAPS dearly. And it goes beyond the science. It goes to really having the support and the resources and knowing that no matter what, it's like somebody's got your back. And like you said, like these are my people. So I love MAPS. I highly, highly recommend that, if you're a medical practitioner of any type, again, like you could be a health coach or a massage therapist, and you might be the person that's speaking to that mother or to that adolescent, that is like, hey, wait, you have this diagnosis, you have these symptoms, and nobody has told you that simple dietary alterations or pre and probiotics, or maybe looking at the underlying viruses or parasites or bacteria or, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, could literally change your symptoms, the quality of your life, and the course of your life. And that's really what it's about, right? Changing the trajectory of all of these kids' lives and making their daily lives better.
Yep.
So.
Absolutely. And, again, these principles that we teach, they're applicable to anybody. It's not stuff we made up. This is pretty much the principles of how you become and stay healthy.
Right.
And again,
the amazing
don't teach that
thing,
in medical school.
Right. And one of the amazing things is like, so a lot of these families that I see, it's like one child brings the family in, but then the whole family alters their lifestyle, right? Because they don't want to single out that one child. So the whole family changes their lifestyle, their diet, what they're doing, what they're cleaning with, how they're thinking, taking certain supplements that they're deficient in. And you see this whole family's health elevate. And, it could be things that the parents are suffering from. And all of a sudden, like those disease processes are reversing. So it's amazing. Thank you for being here with me. I really appreciate you taking the time. We all know how busy you are, but thank you.
I appreciate you having me. I really enjoy doing this.
Good. All right. And for all of our listeners at home, I hope that you found this helpful and it helps you on your journey to healing Lyme. We'll see you next time.